November 6, 1860. Somewhere in the tobacco country of Central Virginia, a plantation owner celebrated Abraham Lincoln's election victory with his favorite Cuban cigars, hand-rolled by the one man he trusted above all others in his household. By dawn, he was dead, his lips stained dark, his fingers clutching at a throat that had swollen shut. The local physician recorded it as apoplexy brought on by excessive celebration. The county records were sealed within a week. What the doctor's private journal revealed 70 years later would suggest something far more deliberate, far more calculated, and far more terrifying than anyone in that community could have imagined. Tonight, we uncover what really happened in that smoking room, and why 3 other men died the exact same way before anyone connected the deaths to the one person present at every celebration. Before we continue with the story of what happened in Buckingham County that election night, I need you to do something. If you're listening from Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, or anywhere in tobacco country, leave a comment telling us what state you're from. This story touches every corner of the South, and I want to know how close you are to where this happened. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now, because stories like this, buried for over a century, are exactly what we uncover on this channel. The truth about that November night didn't emerge all at once. It came in fragments, whispered confessions, burned letters discovered decades later, and one leather-bound journal that should have been destroyed but wasn't. Buckingham County, Virginia, in the autumn of 1860, was a patchwork of rolling hills blanketed in tobacco plants, their broad leaves turning gold as harvest season approached its end. The county sat in the heart of Virginia's tobacco belt, where fortunes were built on the backs of enslaved labor, and the quality of a man's crop determined his standing in society. The soil here was rich, dark, and fertile. The air perpetually carried the sweet, earthy scent of curing tobacco from the barns that dotted the landscape. The Haverford plantation sprawled across 1,200 acres of prime farmland, bisected by the Willis River and bordered by dense forests of oak and pine. The main house stood on a gentle rise, a 3-story Georgian manor with white columns and black shutters, surrounded by magnolias and flowering dogwoods. Behind it stretched the quarters where nearly 90 enslaved people lived, a small village unto itself with its own rhythms, its own whispered conversations, its own carefully guarded secrets. Colonel Marcus Haverford owned this domain with an iron fist wrapped in velvet gloves. At 53 years old, he cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver threading through his dark hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He'd earned his military title during the Mexican War, where he'd served with distinction and developed a taste for the finer things that military pay could never satisfy. His marriage to Catherine Pembroke, daughter of a Richmond tobacco merchant, had secured both his fortune and his social position. The colonel prided himself on being a progressive plantation owner. He didn't use the whip as freely as his neighbors. He allowed his enslaved workers garden plots and the occasional Sunday to themselves. He even permitted some to learn trades beyond field work, though reading and writing remained strictly forbidden. These small mercies, he believed, made him enlightened. They made him beloved among certain circles in Richmond who considered themselves forward-thinking while still defending the institution that made their lifestyle possible. But there were things the colonel could not abide: insolence, laziness, theft, and above all, any suggestion that the people he owned might imagine themselves his equals. For these transgressions, punishment came swiftly and publicly. The overseer, a rail-thin man named Silas Portwood, carried out these punishments with mechanical efficiency, his face betraying no emotion as he administered the lash or fitted the iron collar. In the hierarchy of the Haverford plantation, one man occupied a unique position. His name was Benjamin, though everyone called him Benj, and he had been born on the property 34 years earlier. His mother, Celia, had worked in the main house until her death from fever when Benj was 12. The colonel, recognizing the boy's quick mind and steady hands, had trained him in the art of tobacco preparation, a skill that required years to master and was worth its weight in gold. Benj had light brown skin, thoughtful dark eyes, and a quiet demeanor that made him easy to overlook. He was average height, slim but strong from years of physical labor, with long fingers stained permanently brown from handling tobacco leaves. He rarely smiled, but he never scowled either. He moved through the plantation like water, finding the path of least resistance, drawing no attention to himself, always watching, always listening. The colonel trusted Benj in a way he trusted few others, white or black. Benj had access to the colonel's private office, his study, even his bedroom when delivering the special cigars the colonel favored. Benj knew which tobacco leaves to select for rolling, how to age them properly, how to add just the right touch of rum or brandy to the tobacco for flavor. He knew the colonel's preferences better than the colonel's own wife did. What the colonel didn't know was that Benj could read. His mother had taught him in secret, using a battered Bible and newspapers she'd stolen from the trash. She'd made him swear never to reveal this skill, had impressed upon him that knowledge was the most dangerous thing a slave could possess. When she died, Benj had continued his education in stolen moments, reading whatever he could find, teaching himself about the world beyond the plantation's boundaries. He'd read about the debates in Congress. He'd studied the maps showing free states and slave states. He'd learned about poison from a medical text he'd found in the colonel's library, memorizing the symptoms of various toxic substances before carefully returning the book to its shelf. He knew about belladonna and arsenic, about hemlock and foxglove, about all the things that grew in Virginia's woods and gardens that could kill a man if prepared correctly. And he knew about tobacco, not just how to cure it and roll it, but about the chemicals it contained, about nicotine's properties as both stimulant and poison, about dosage and concentration, and the fine line between pleasure and death. The autumn of 1860 brought unprecedented tension to Buckingham County. The presidential election loomed, and the very air seemed charged with anxiety. In Richmond, politicians thundered about states' rights and northern aggression. In plantation dining rooms, men debated whether Virginia would follow South Carolina into secession if Lincoln won. In the quarters, enslaved people whispered about what might happen if the Republicans took power, though few dared hope for actual freedom. Colonel Haverford was a Southern Democrat, a supporter of John Breckinridge, and a fierce defender of slavery as both economic necessity and biblical mandate. But he was also a pragmatist. He'd diversified his investments, maintaining business connections in the North, hedging his bets against political upheaval. Some of his neighbors considered this nearly treasonous. The colonel considered it good business. He hosted a dinner party 2 weeks before the election, gathering a dozen of the county's most prominent men to discuss strategy. Benj served the meal and poured the wine, his face a mask of respectful attentiveness, while his ears captured every word. They talked about mobilizing voters, about intimidation tactics for those who might support the Republicans, about contingency plans if Lincoln won. One man, a lawyer named Sutherland, suggested that Lincoln's election might be the spark that lights the powder keg of Southern independence. The colonel disagreed. Lincoln's election means nothing without congressional support. The man's a backwoods lawyer with delusions of adequacy. He'll be hamstrung from day one. We'll weather this storm as we've weathered all the others. Our way of life is ordained by God and secured by economics. No amount of northern moral posturing can change that. As Benj refilled the colonel's glass, their eyes met for just a moment. The colonel saw nothing but dutiful service. Benj saw a man who believed himself invulnerable, a man who'd grown comfortable in his power, a man who'd forgotten that the people he owned were still people, still capable of thought and planning and rage. After the guests departed, the colonel retired to his study for his evening cigar. Benj brought him his favorite blend, a rich Maduro wrapped in a Connecticut broadleaf, perfectly rolled and aged for exactly 6 months. The colonel lit it with a satisfied sigh, settling back in his leather chair to savor the complex flavors, the smooth draw, the perfect burn. "You've outdone yourself with this batch, Benj," the colonel said, examining the cigar with appreciation. The flavor is exceptional. What did you do differently? Just a touch more aging time, sir, Benj replied softly, and I selected only the finest leaves from last season's crop, the ones that cured in the north barn, where the temperature stayed most consistent. Well, whatever you did, keep doing it. These are the finest cigars I've ever smoked, and I've smoked Cuban tobacco that cost more than you're worth. Benj nodded, his expression unchanging. Thank you, sir. I'll prepare another batch for next month. The colonel didn't notice that Benji's hands never trembled, that his voice never wavered, that he showed no reaction at all to being valued less than rolled tobacco. Benj had learned long ago to bury his feelings so deep that even he sometimes forgot they were there. But they were there, waiting, patient as the tobacco curing in the barns. Election day arrived under grey November skies, the air sharp with the promise of winter. Polls in Buckingham County opened at dawn, though voting was restricted to white male property owners, a fraction of the population. The colonel rode into town early, dressed in his finest suit, eager to cast his ballot, and then retire to the courthouse to await results with other men of standing. The news came by telegraph before midnight. Abraham Lincoln had won. He'd carried the North decisively, and though he'd received not a single electoral vote from the South, the mathematics of victory were undeniable. In Buckingham County, the courthouse erupted in angry shouting. Men who'd been drinking since the polls closed now drank harder, their voices rising in fury and disbelief. The colonel returned to the plantation around 2 in the morning, his carriage rattling up the dark drive at dangerous speed. He stormed into the house, shouting for his wife, for whiskey, for Benj to bring his cigars. Catherine Haverford appeared in her dressing gown, her face pale and frightened. The house slaves emerged from their rooms, roused by their master's bellowing. "It's done," the colonel announced, his face flushed with alcohol and rage. "That rail-splitting bastard has won, but I'll be damned if it changes anything on my land. Do you hear me? Nothing changes here." He stalked into his study and slammed the door. Through the heavy wood, the household could hear him pacing, cursing, throwing things. Catherine retreated to her room. The other servants exchanged glances and disappeared back to their quarters, grateful not to be the target of the colonel's wrath. Only Benj remained, standing in the hallway outside the study, waiting. He knew the colonel would summon him. The man always smoked when agitated, and tonight he would smoke more than usual. Benj had prepared for this. For months, he'd been preparing. Ever since he'd decided that he could no longer live as property, that he would rather die trying to be free than spend another decade serving a man who considered him less than human. The preparation had been meticulous. Benj had access to the tobacco stores, to the curing barns, to every step of the cigar-making process. He'd studied the medical text carefully, learning exactly how much concentrated nicotine extract could be absorbed through the mucous membranes of the mouth and throat before it became lethal. Too little, and the colonel would merely become ill. Too much, and death would come so quickly that suspicion would be inevitable. The key was patience. Gradual exposure, building up over time so that symptoms could be attributed to natural causes or stress. Benj had been lacing the colonel's cigars for 3 months, using extract rendered down from the stemmed tobacco stems and the lowest quality leaves, the parts normally discarded. He'd mixed it with the rum used for flavoring, applied it to the wrapper leaves, incorporated it into the binding. The doses had been small at first, barely perceptible. The colonel had experienced occasional nausea, some dizziness, but nothing alarming. Nothing that couldn't be blamed on rich food or too much wine. Benj had watched carefully, adjusting the dosage, learning how the colonel's body responded, finding the threshold. Tonight would be different. Tonight, with the colonel already compromised by alcohol and rage, with his heart racing and his blood pressure elevated, Benj would give him the special cigars he'd prepared for this occasion. The ones with 5 times the normal concentration. The ones that would finish what 3 months of careful poisoning had begun. The study door opened. The colonel stood framed in lamplight, his cravat loosened, his eyes wild. "Benj, where the hell are you? Bring me my cigars, the whole box, and brandy, the good French brandy." "Yes, sir," Benj replied, his voice steady. "Right away, sir." He walked to the colonel's private closet where the best cigars were kept in a humidor, a beautiful wooden box with Spanish cedar lining that maintained the perfect environment. Benj had prepared 2 boxes of cigars that looked identical to the colonel's usual favorites. One box contained cigars with his standard preparation. The other contained the cigars that would kill the colonel before dawn. Benji selected the lethal box and carried it to the study, along with a crystal decanter of brandy and a glass. The colonel had collapsed into his leather chair, his face in his hands. When he looked up, Benj saw something he'd rarely witnessed, genuine fear behind the anger. "Do you understand what this means?" Benj the colonel asked, his voice hoarse. "That man Lincoln wants to destroy everything we've built here. He wants to tear down the entire social order, the very foundation of civilization." "It must be very troubling, sir," Benj said, setting down the box and pouring brandy. "Troubling, it's catastrophic. There will be war, mark my words. And when it comes, every man in Virginia will have to choose a side." The colonel took the brandy glass and drank deeply. "But not tonight. Tonight, I'm going to smoke and drink and try to forget, for a few hours, what's coming." He opened the cigar box and selected one, examining it with bleary appreciation. "At least I still have these. At least I still have the best tobacco in Virginia, and a man who knows how to prepare it properly." He lit the cigar and drew deeply, his eyes closing in momentary pleasure. Benj stood quietly by the door, watching. The colonel smoked steadily, working through the first cigar in less than 20 minutes, before immediately lighting a second. He drank more brandy. He ranted about northern aggression, about states' rights, about the Constitution. His words became increasingly slurred, his movements less coordinated. "You're a good Negro, Benj," the colonel said at one point, his eyes struggling to focus. "I've always treated you fairly. Haven't I given you important work? Trusted you with responsibilities? You're grateful for that, aren't you?" "Yes, sir," Benj replied. Inside his chest, his heart hammered, but his face remained impassive. "Very grateful, sir." The colonel finished the second cigar and reached for a third. His hand trembled slightly as he brought it to his lips. Feeling oddly warm, he muttered, "Must be the brandy." But he lit the cigar anyway, drawing the poisoned smoke deep into his lungs, letting it coat his mouth and throat with concentrated nicotine that his body could no longer process. By the 4th cigar, the colonel's skin had taken on a grayish pallor. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool night air. His breathing had become labored, each inhalation requiring visible effort. He tried to stand but fell back into the chair, his legs refusing to support him. "Don't feel well," he gasped. "Something's wrong. Benj, get the doctor." "Right away, sir," Benj said, but he didn't move. He stood there, watching the colonel's pupils dilate, watching his hands clutch at his chest, watching the man who'd owned him struggle for breath. The colonel's eyes widened with sudden understanding. He looked at Benj, really looked at him, and in that moment seemed to see past the mask of dutiful servitude to the intelligence and rage beneath. "You," he whispered. "You did this." Benj said nothing. He simply stood there, his face expressionless, as the colonel's breathing became increasingly shallow and rapid. Nicotine poisoning, Benj knew from his reading, caused the heart to race while simultaneously paralyzing the muscles needed for breathing. The victim remained conscious almost until the end, aware of what was happening, but unable to stop it. The colonel tried to call out, but his throat had swollen, his voice reduced to a strangled wheeze. He reached toward Benj with one shaking hand, whether in appeal or accusation, Benj couldn't tell and didn't care. He watched as the colonel's hand fell back to the armrest, as his eyes glazed over, as his chest stilled. The study clock chimed 4 times. Outside, the first birds began their pre-dawn songs. Inside, the colonel slumped in his chair, his lips stained dark from tobacco. 4 cigars burned down to nubs in the ashtray beside him, an empty brandy decanter on the desk. Benj finally moved. He walked to the colonel and checked for a pulse, finding none. He collected the cigar box with the poisoned cigars and replaced it with the identical box containing normal ones. He arranged the scene carefully, making sure everything looked like a man who'd smoked and drunk himself into an early grave, overcome by rage and anxiety on the worst night of his political life. Then he walked out of the study, closing the door quietly behind him. He returned to his small room in the servants' quarter attached to the main house, lay down on his narrow bed, and stared at the ceiling until the sun rose. He felt nothing. No triumph, no guilt, no fear. Just a vast emptiness where emotion should have been, and the certain knowledge that this was only the beginning. The household discovered the colonel's body at 7 that morning when Catherine sent a maid to wake him for breakfast. The girl's screams brought the entire house running. Catherine took one look at her husband's grey face and collapsed in hysterics. The overseer, Portwood, sent a rider to fetch Dr. Nathaniel Grimsby from town, while trying to maintain order among the increasingly agitated household. Dr. Grimsby arrived within the hour, a middle-aged man with spectacles and a perpetually worried expression. He examined the colonel's body thoroughly, noting the discoloration, the position, the evidence of heavy smoking and drinking. He questioned Catherine about her husband's state of mind the previous evening, documented the political stress and excessive celebration. Apoplexy, he pronounced finally, brought on by excessive agitation, alcohol and tobacco use. I've seen it before in men of the colonel's age and temperament. The shock of the election results, combined with his intemperate habits, proved too much for his constitution. Catherine accepted this explanation through her tears. The servants accepted it because they had no choice. The neighbors who came to pay their respects accepted it because it fit their understanding of how the world worked. Prominent men sometimes dropped dead from stroke or heart failure, especially during times of stress. There was nothing suspicious about it. Only Benj knew the truth, and he carried that knowledge like a stone in his chest, heavy but manageable. The funeral took place 3 days later under cold November rain. Nearly 200 people attended, filling the small Episcopal church in town and spilling out into the muddy churchyard. They buried the colonel in the family plot on the plantation, beside his parents and his infant son, who died of fever in 1847. The Episcopal minister delivered a lengthy eulogy praising the colonel's service to Virginia, his business acumen, his kindness to his dependents. Benj stood in the back with the other house servants, his head bowed respectfully, listening to the minister describe a man he'd never known. The colonel the minister eulogized bore little resemblance to the man who'd told Benj he was worth less than a cigar, who'd watched without expression as Portwood whipped field hands for minor infractions, who'd sold a woman's children to settle a gambling debt. After the funeral, Catherine retreated to her room and didn't emerge for a week. The plantation fell into an uneasy limbo. Portwood continued running the agricultural operations, but questions of ownership and long-term management remained unresolved. The colonel had died without a will, and his nearest male relative was a nephew in Charleston who showed no interest in managing a Virginia tobacco plantation. The weeks following the funeral brought a strange, suspended atmosphere to the Haverford plantation. Work continued in the fields and barns, but without the colonel's driving presence, everything moved more slowly. Catherine remained closeted in her rooms, seeing no one but her personal maid. Portwood grew increasingly harsh, as if trying to compensate for the absence of authority with excessive discipline. Benj continued his work, preparing tobacco, rolling cigars, moving through the house like a ghost. No one questioned him. No one suspected him. He was just property, as invisible as furniture, as unremarkable as the walls. But change was coming to Virginia. Change that would sweep away the old certainties and replace them with chaos. Lincoln's inauguration in March brought South Carolina's secession, followed rapidly by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. The Confederacy formed. Fort Sumter fell. Virginia debated and agonized, and finally, in April, voted to secede. By May, Catherine had made her decision. She would sell the plantation and return to Richmond, to her father's house, where she'd be safe from whatever war was coming. The nephew from Charleston agreed to handle the sale. Portwood would stay on to manage the property until a buyer could be found. The enslaved population of the plantation heard these plans through the whisper network that conveyed information faster than any telegraph. They knew their futures hung in the balance. Would they be sold together or separately? Would the new owner be cruel or merely indifferent? Would the coming war bring freedom or just new forms of oppression? Benj listened to these whispered conversations but participated in none of them. He had his own plans now, plans that had been crystallizing since the colonel's death. He would run north, to Union lines, to freedom. But he wouldn't run empty-handed. In the colonel's study, which Catherine had kept locked since her husband's death, there were documents, deeds, contracts, account books, correspondence, evidence of business dealings, debts owed and owing, investments both legitimate and questionable. Benj had seen these papers during his years of service. He'd read them when the colonel wasn't looking, memorizing names and numbers. He knew which of the colonel's business associates in Richmond had Confederate sympathies. He knew which ones maintained Northern connections. He knew about the weapons stored in the barn behind the cooperage, ostensibly for plantation defense, but actually intended for Confederate forces. He knew about the gold coins hidden in a floor safe in the colonel's bedroom. This knowledge could be valuable. To the right people, it could be very valuable indeed. 2 weeks before Catherine's planned departure for Richmond, Benj made his move. He waited until a cloudy, moonless night when Portwood had ridden into town for supplies. Using a key he'd made months earlier from a wax impression, he let himself into the colonel's study. Working by the light of a shielded candle, he photographed his memory of the most important documents, committing specific details to memory since he couldn't risk taking the originals. Names, dates, amounts, locations, evidence of Confederate weapons caches, lists of Southern sympathizers in northern cities, correspondence suggesting plots to disrupt Union supply lines. He found the deed to the plantation, noting the property boundaries and the names of neighboring landowners. He found the household inventory, including the names and estimated values of every enslaved person on the property. His own name was there, Benjamin, age 34, tobacco specialist, valued at $1,800. $1,800. That was what he was worth to these people. Less than a good horse. Less than the chandelier hanging in the dining room. He committed it all to memory, then carefully returned everything to its place. He locked the study door and slipped back to his room without encountering anyone. The next morning he worked as usual, showing no sign of the previous night's activities. 3 days later, he disappeared. The discovery of Benj's absence came at dawn, when the cook needed tobacco brought from the curing barn for the household's morning supply. She sent a boy to fetch Benj, but his room was empty, his few possessions gone, his palate cold. Portwood was summoned. A search of the plantation revealed nothing. Benj had vanished like smoke. Portwood was beside himself with fury. Catherine, when informed, seemed more bewildered than angry. "But why would he run?" she asked. "We always treated him well. He had important work, responsibilities. Why would he throw all that away?" The answer, of course, was that Benj had never had anything to throw away. He'd only had a slightly more comfortable form of bondage, and he'd chosen possible freedom over certain slavery. But Catherine, like her husband before her, couldn't understand that the people she owned might have desires and dreams beyond serving her comfort. Portwood organized a search party, hiring professional slave catchers from Richmond, men with dogs and guns and no mercy. They searched the woods surrounding the plantation, questioned enslaved people on neighboring properties, followed the roads north toward Washington. They found nothing. Benj had disappeared as completely as if the earth had swallowed him. What they didn't know was that Benj had never intended to run north on the roads, where patrols and checkpoints made passage nearly impossible for a black man without papers. He'd gone west instead, into the mountains, following paths known only to runaways and the few white abolitionists who aided them. He'd connected with the Underground Railroad in the foothills of the Blue Ridge, been passed from safe house to safe house, eventually making his way to Pennsylvania and then to Massachusetts. By July, he was in Boston, free but penniless, working as a laborer in a warehouse while trying to figure out how to use the information he carried. By August, he'd made contact with certain individuals who understood the value of intelligence from behind Confederate lines. By September, he was sharing what he knew with people who could act on it. But that wasn't the end of the story. In fact, it was barely the beginning. Because back in Virginia, something strange was happening on the Haverford plantation. 3 months after Benji's disappearance, Silas Portwood died. Like the colonel before him, he died in his office, slumped over his desk, surrounded by evidence of heavy smoking. The local doctor, still Dr. Grimsby, pronounced it apoplexy, just as he had with the colonel. The plantation's enslaved population whispered about curses and divine justice, but they kept their voices low and their theories private. Catherine, now thoroughly unnerved, accelerated her plans to leave. The plantation was sold at a loss to a speculator from Richmond who planned to run it with hired overseers while he focused on more profitable wartime business. The new owner lasted 6 months. He died in February 1862, found in the plantation's main house study, his lips stained dark, several expensive cigars burned to ash in the tray beside him. Once again, Dr. Grimsby was called. Once again, he diagnosed apoplexy, but this time, he was troubled. 3 men, 3 deaths, all in the same location, all presenting with similar symptoms, all associated with the same plantation. He confided his concerns to the sheriff, who suggested that perhaps the study itself was the problem. Bad air, perhaps, miasma from the river, something in the ventilation. They had the study thoroughly cleaned and aired. They burned sulfur candles to purify the space. They brought in a builder to check the walls and floors for rot or mold. They found nothing unusual, just a well-appointed room with book-lined shelves, a large desk, comfortable chairs, and a persistent smell of tobacco smoke that no amount of cleaning could eliminate. The property changed hands twice more during the war, each time at a lower price. Neither owner lived there long. One sold quickly, citing business opportunities elsewhere. The other died, though this time in his own home in Richmond, rather than on the plantation itself. The doctor who attended that death noted symptoms consistent with chronic nicotine poisoning, but couldn't determine the source. By 1863, the Haverford plantation had acquired a reputation. People in Buckingham County spoke of it as cursed, as a place where death lingered in the very walls. The enslaved population had been sold off and scattered to other properties. The fields went unplanted. The house stood empty, its windows dark, its doors locked. Dr. Grimsby, troubled by the pattern of deaths, began keeping detailed notes in his private journal. He documented each case, noting similarities and differences, searching for a pattern that made medical sense. He never found one, at least not one he could prove. But he had his suspicions. In an entry dated March 15, 1863, he wrote, "I am increasingly convinced that the deaths at the Haverford property are not natural, though I cannot determine the mechanism. All victims were smokers of expensive cigars. All died with similar presentations: rapid heartbeat, difficulty breathing, gray pallor, dilated pupils. The symptoms are consistent with nicotine poisoning, but at concentrations that should not be possible from ordinary tobacco use. Could the cigars themselves have been deliberately tainted, but by whom and when? The original victim, Colonel Haverford, kept his cigars locked away. Only his most trusted servants had access. I am left with an impossible conclusion that one of his servants somehow learned to weaponize tobacco, using the Colonel's own vice against him. But how, and more troublingly, if this was murder, what happened to the other victims? Did the poisoner return, or did he leave something behind? some cache of tainted cigars that continued to kill long after his departure. Grimsby never published these suspicions. The war was raging, and he had more immediate concerns than mysterious deaths on an abandoned plantation. He treated wounded soldiers, delivered babies, and tried to keep his community alive through years of deprivation and occupation. His journal remained private, locked in a drawer in his office. But he wasn't wrong. The deaths weren't natural. And the answer lay not in cursed ground or bad air, but in a dozen boxes of cigars that Benj had prepared before his escape. Cigars infused with concentrated nicotine extract at levels just below immediately lethal, but well above safe. He'd hidden these boxes throughout the plantation, in the humidors where the colonel kept his best tobacco, in the overseer's office, in the main house's smoking room. Every man who purchased the Haverford plantation inherited not just land and buildings, but a slow death hidden in wooden boxes with Spanish cedar lining. Every man who lit one of those specially prepared cigars was consuming poison, building up toxic levels in his bloodstream with each smoke, until his body could no longer compensate. Benji had calculated it perfectly. The deaths would be spaced far enough apart to seem like coincidence. The symptoms would match known natural causes, and by the time anyone suspected murder, he would be long gone, impossible to find, impossible to prosecute. It was revenge not just for himself, but for every person the colonel had owned, every person Portwood had whipped, every family the system had torn apart. It was justice administered through chemistry and patience, delivered through the very symbol of the plantation owner's wealth and status. By 1864, the Haverford plantation had passed to the Commonwealth of Virginia as payment for unpaid taxes. The state attempted to sell it twice but found no buyers. The property sat vacant through the final years of the war and into Reconstruction, its fields reverting to wild growth, its buildings slowly deteriorating. In 1868, a northern investor named Harold Grissom purchased the property for a fraction of its pre-war value. Grissom was a Union veteran from Pennsylvania who'd made his fortune selling supplies to the army and now sought to establish himself as a Virginia landowner. He'd heard the rumors about the property but dismissed them as Southern superstition. He hired local workers to restore the main house and brought in his family from Philadelphia. Grissom was a cigar enthusiast. He'd acquired a taste for expensive tobacco during his war service and prided himself on his collection. When he moved into the Haverford mansion, he was delighted to discover several boxes of cigars in a hidden compartment in the study, apparently overlooked by previous owners or looters. The cigars appeared to be in excellent condition despite their age. The wooden boxes had protected them from moisture and pests. Grissom, recognizing quality tobacco when he saw it, was thrilled by his find. He tested one cigar and found it exceptional, the flavor rich and complex, the construction flawless. He made a note in his diary about his good fortune in discovering such a cache. His wife, Margaret, worried about smoking cigars of unknown provenance, but Grissom laughed off her concerns. "These are Virginia's finest tobacco, my dear. Better than anything you can buy in Philadelphia." The previous owner clearly had excellent taste. He smoked them regularly throughout that summer, working in the study as he made plans to restore the plantation to profitability. He would grow tobacco again, he decided, though he'd use free labor instead of enslaved. He'd modernize the operation, apply northern efficiency to southern agriculture. He'd prove that the plantation system had been economically inefficient all along. By September, Grissom was frequently ill. He complained of dizziness, nausea, irregular heartbeat. The local doctor, no longer Dr. Grimsby, who died during the war, attributed these symptoms to the Virginia heat and the stress of managing a large property. He prescribed rest and moderation in all things. Grissom ignored this advice. He continued smoking his cigars, continued pushing himself to work long hours, continued making plans for the plantation's future. By October, his symptoms had worsened dramatically. His hands trembled constantly. His skin had taken on a grayish cast. He experienced frequent episodes where his heart would race uncontrollably, leaving him gasping for breath. His wife insisted on bringing in a specialist from Richmond. Dr. Edmund Waters examined Grissom thoroughly and found him suffering from what appeared to be chronic nicotine poisoning. When questioned about his tobacco use, Grissom admitted to smoking 5 or 6 cigars daily, sometimes more when working late. "That's excessive," Dr. Waters said bluntly, "but shouldn't produce symptoms this severe unless the tobacco itself is unusually potent or somehow contaminated." He asked to examine Grissom's cigars. Grissom showed him the boxes he'd found, explaining that they'd been hidden in the study for years. Dr. Waters took several cigars back to Richmond for analysis by a chemist he knew at the Medical College of Virginia. The chemist's report, delivered 2 weeks later, was alarming. The cigars contained nicotine at concentrations 4 to 5 times higher than normal. More disturbing, the distribution was uneven, suggesting deliberate adulteration rather than natural variation. Someone had infused these cigars with concentrated nicotine extract, essentially turning them into poison delivery devices. Dr. Waters immediately sent word to Grissom to stop smoking the cigars and destroy them. But the message arrived too late. Grissom had died the night before, alone in his study, a half-smoked cigar still clutched between his fingers. The local sheriff, prompted by Dr. Waters' report, opened an investigation. He questioned the household staff, examined the study, and sent more cigars to Richmond for analysis. All tested positive for excessive nicotine. The sheriff concluded that Grissom had died by misadventure, the victim of tainted tobacco of unknown origin. But Dr. Waters wasn't satisfied with this explanation. He knew the Haverford plantation's history, knew about the previous deaths. He requested access to Dr. Grimsby's papers and was eventually given permission to review the old doctor's private journals. Reading Grimsby's suspicions, Waters began to piece together a pattern. All the deaths involved men who'd purchased the Haverford plantation. All had occurred in or around the study. All involved heavy cigar smoking, and all had presented with symptoms consistent with nicotine poisoning. The first death, Colonel Haverford himself, had occurred in November 1860, the night of Lincoln's election. The colonel had been a heavy smoker who had a slave named Benjamin prepare his cigars. Benjamin had disappeared shortly after the colonel's death, ostensibly running north to Union territory. What if Benjamin hadn't just been running from slavery? What if he'd been fleeing from murder? What if he'd spent months, perhaps years, carefully poisoning his owner through the very cigars the colonel prized so highly? Waters couldn't prove any of this. Benjamin, if he was still alive, was somewhere in the north, beyond Virginia's jurisdiction. The other potential witnesses, the enslaved people who'd lived on the plantation, had been sold and scattered. The physical evidence, the poisoned cigars, had now been destroyed on his own orders to prevent further deaths. But the pattern was clear. Someone, almost certainly Benjamin, had created those lethal cigars before his escape. He'd hidden them throughout the plantation, knowing they'd eventually find new victims among the men who profited from slavery. He'd weaponized tobacco, turning the plantation's cash crop into an instrument of delayed revenge. Dr. Waters documented his theory in a detailed report to the sheriff, laying out the evidence and explaining the medical mechanism. The sheriff filed it away, unsure what to do with accusations against a man who'd been gone for nearly 8 years and whose current whereabouts were unknown. The Grissom family sued the Commonwealth of Virginia, claiming they'd been sold a death trap. The case dragged through courts for 2 years before being dismissed. The Haverford plantation reverted to the state once again. This time, no one would buy it. The property acquired a reputation as genuinely cursed, a place where death lingered in the very foundations. Local people told stories about it, each tale growing more elaborate with retelling. They spoke of angry ghosts and land soaked in suffering, of tobacco fields that refused to grow, and buildings that repelled all inhabitants. The truth, as Waters understood it, was both simpler and more terrifying than any ghost story. The curse wasn't supernatural. It was chemical, calculated, and entirely human. It was the revenge of a man who'd been reduced to property, who'd studied his oppressors' weaknesses and exploited them with methodical precision. In 1872, 12 years after Colonel Haverford's death, a letter arrived at Dr. Edmund Vorter's office in Richmond. It bore a Boston postmark and no return address. Inside, written in precise, educated handwriting, was a confession. The letter began simply, "Sir, I understand you have been investigating the deaths at the former Haverford plantation in Buckingham County. I write to inform you that your suspicions are correct. My name is Benjamin Freeman, formerly the property of Colonel Marcus Haverford. I killed him. I also killed Silas Portwood and created the means by which several other men died. I am not sorry. I am writing to you so that the truth may be known, and so that you may understand that what happened was not curse or accident, but justice." The letter continued for several pages, laying out in clinical detail exactly what Benj had done. He described his years of study, learning to read in secret, educating himself from stolen books. He explained his discovery of nicotine's properties as both stimulant and poison, his experiments with concentration and dosage, his careful testing to find the threshold between illness and death. "I began with small doses," the letter read, "mixed into the Colonel's cigars over a period of months. He would feel mildly unwell but attribute it to other causes. His body was building up a tolerance, but also accumulating damage to his heart and nervous system. By election night, he was already compromised. The heavily dosed cigars I prepared for that evening were merely the final blow to a system already weakened." Benj described his preparation of additional boxes of poisoned cigars, his decision to hide them throughout the plantation. "I knew the property would be sold," he wrote. "I knew other men would come, men who saw profit in the land where I and others had suffered. I left them gifts. Boxes of the finest tobacco, aged and rolled to perfection, infused with concentrated death. Whoever found them would think themselves fortunate. They would smoke, and they would die, as the Colonel died, wondering what had gone wrong." The letter explained his escape, his journey north, his new life in Boston. He'd taken the surname Freeman for obvious reasons. He worked as a tobacconist, ironically enough, using his legitimate skills to earn an honest living. He'd married. He had children. He was, by all measures, a respectable member of his community. "I tell you this," the letter concluded, "not from guilt, for I feel none, but from a desire for truth. The world should know that what happened at the Haverford plantation was not mysterious or supernatural. It was the deliberate action of a man who had been told his entire life that he was property, that he existed only to serve, that his thoughts and feelings in humanity meant nothing. I proved them wrong. I proved that the people they enslaved were capable of great complexity of thought and action. I proved that we could plan, could execute, could achieve goals that required patience, intelligence, and skill. In killing my oppressor with his own cigars, I demonstrated more sophistication than most of them credited any Negro with possessing. That demonstration, sir, was as much the point as the revenge itself." Dr. Waters sat in his office for a long time after reading this letter, staring at the careful handwriting, considering what to do. He was technically in possession of a murder confession. Benjamin Freeman had admitted to multiple killings and had provided enough detail to remove any doubt about his guilt. But Waters was also a man who'd lived through the war, who'd seen slavery firsthand, who'd treated wounds on both sides and come to his own conclusions about the institution and its defenders. He thought about Colonel Haverford, who'd owned 90 human beings and considered it his God-given right. He thought about Portwood, who'd whipped men for sport. He thought about the speculators who'd purchased the plantation hoping to profit from it. Then he thought about Benjamin Freeman, who'd been born into slavery, who'd educated himself in secret, who'd endured decades of degradation and dehumanization, and who'd finally struck back using nothing but intelligence and patience. After considerable deliberation, Waters took the letter to his fireplace and burned it. He told no one about its contents. He made no report to authorities. Instead, he wrote his own account of the Haverford plantation deaths, documenting the medical evidence of nicotine poisoning but attributing it to unknown parties, likely among the former enslaved population, identity uncertain and whereabouts unknown. He filed this report with the sheriff's office and considered the matter closed. If Benjamin Freeman was living peacefully in Boston, married and working an honest trade, what purpose would be served by prosecution? The man had been property. Under the laws that had governed Virginia for decades, he'd had no legal rights, no recourse against abuse, no hope of justice through legitimate channels. He'd created his own justice. Waters couldn't bring himself to condemn him for it. The Haverford plantation remained unsold through the 1870s and into the 1880s. The buildings gradually deteriorated, reclaimed by vines and weather. Local children dared each other to approach the property after dark, spinning ever more elaborate stories about what haunted it. Occasionally, someone would break in to explore, but they never stayed long. The house felt wrong, they said. Too quiet, too heavy with the weight of old suffering. During this period of abandonment, something curious happened. Former enslaved people from the Haverford plantation, now scattered across Virginia and beyond, began to share stories among themselves. In churches and gathering halls, in private conversations held far from white ears, they spoke of Benj. Most had known him as quiet, unremarkable, a man who kept to himself and did his work without complaint. But now they remembered small things. The way he'd sometimes watch the colonel with an unreadable expression, how he'd always seemed to know things he shouldn't know, how he'd disappeared the very week the colonel died. Some claimed they'd known all along what he'd done. Others swore they'd suspected but had kept silent, understanding that silence was the only protection they could offer. A few elderly men and women, freed by the war and now living in Richmond's growing black community, would occasionally tell younger generations about the tobacco man who made his master smoke death. The stories were never detailed, always vague enough to maintain deniability. But the message was clear: resistance was possible, even for those who seemed powerless. One woman, formerly enslaved on a neighboring plantation, told her grandchildren in 1891 about a conversation she'd had with Benj years before his escape. They'd been at a quilting bee, where enslaved people from several plantations had gathered. Benj had been quiet as always, but at one point he'd said something that stuck with her. Tobacco built this world. Maybe tobacco can tear it down too. She hadn't understood what he meant at the time. Only later, after the deaths began, did his words take on new significance. The transformation of the Haverford property reflected broader changes sweeping through Virginia during Reconstruction and beyond. The old plantation system had collapsed, replaced by sharecropping and wage labor that often proved only marginally better than slavery. But the land itself became symbolic of something. The impermanence of the system that had seemed eternal, the vulnerability of those who'd believed themselves invincible. By the time the main house burned in 1889, attitudes toward the property had calcified into superstition and avoidance. No developer would touch it. No farmer wanted to build near the old house site. The very ground seemed tainted, though of course it was memory that poisoned the land, not anything in the soil itself. The stories grew more elaborate with each telling. Lights seen in windows of the ruined house, phantom smells of tobacco smoke drifting through empty rooms, the sound of footsteps pacing the study where so many had died. What no one discussed openly, but many understood privately, was that the curse on the Haverford plantation was the curse of slavery itself. The property had been built on human suffering, maintained through violence and degradation, and when that foundation crumbled, everything built upon it collapsed as well. The deaths of the white men who'd tried to profit from it seemed like justice to some, coincidence to others, but everyone agreed the place was better left abandoned. In 1896, 2 years after Benjamin Freeman's death in Boston, a black newspaper in Richmond published a cryptic obituary notice that had been submitted anonymously. It read, "Benjamin Freeman, formerly of Buckingham County, died in Boston at age 68. He was a tobacconist of great skill, known for the care he took in his craft. He leaves behind a wife, 3 children, and a legacy that some will understand and others will never comprehend. May he rest in the freedom he earned. The notice generated no comment from white newspapers, but it was quietly reprinted in black publications across Virginia and as far north as Philadelphia. The land itself was eventually subdivided and sold to various farmers who planted corn and wheat instead of tobacco. None of the new owners built on the original house site. They all chose different locations, as far from the old center of the plantation as possible. The original boundaries were forgotten. The memory of what had happened there faded into local legend, another ghost story among many. Dr. Edmund Waters died in 1895, taking his knowledge of Benjamin Freeman's confession to his grave. His papers were donated to the Medical College of Virginia, where they sat unexamined in archives for decades. Dr. Grimsby's journals ended up in the possession of a local historical society, catalogued but unread. It wasn't until the 1930s that a researcher examining pre-Civil War medical records stumbled across both sets of documents and recognized their connection. By then, everyone involved was long dead. Benjamin Freeman, if he'd survived to old age, would have been over 100 years old. The researcher published a brief article in a regional history journal speculating about the strange pattern of deaths at the Haverford plantation, but offering no definitive conclusions. The truth remained hidden in plain sight, buried in old journals and archived letters, waiting for someone to piece it together. That finally happened in 1958, when a graduate student at the University of Virginia, researching plantation life in Buckingham County for her dissertation, found Waters' unpublished account among his papers. The account mentioned a letter from someone named Benjamin Freeman, but didn't include the letter itself, which Waters had destroyed. Intrigued, the student cross-referenced the name with Boston city directories from the 1870s and 1880s. She found a Benjamin Freeman listed as a tobacconist on Beacon Street, married to a woman named Harriet, with 3 children. The business had operated successfully for over 20 years before Freeman's death in 1894 at the age of 68. Further research uncovered a brief obituary in a Boston newspaper, describing Freeman as a respected member of the community, a deacon at his church, a skilled craftsman known for the quality of his tobacco products. The obituary made no mention of his birth in slavery or his origins in Virginia. He'd created a new life, a new identity, and kept his secrets until death. The student included these findings in her dissertation, but framed them carefully, presenting them as suggestive but not conclusive evidence of one enslaved person's remarkable act of resistance. She noted that if Benjamin Freeman had indeed poisoned Colonel Haverford and others, his actions represented a level of sophisticated planning and execution that challenged contemporary assumptions about the intellectual capabilities of enslaved people. Her dissertation was accepted but not widely read. The full story of what happened at the Haverford plantation remained obscure, known only to a handful of academics and local historians. The property itself continued its quiet existence as farmland, its dark history forgotten by the families who worked the soil. But the truth, once discovered, has a way of persisting. In the 1980s, another researcher working on a book about slave resistance in Virginia found the graduate student's dissertation and recognized its significance. She investigated further, finding additional evidence in shipping records that showed Haverford importing Cuban tobacco and in account books that documented the plantation's cigar production. She published a book in 1992 titled Poisoned Tobacco, Benjamin Freeman, and the Haverford Plantation Murders. The book presented the full story, drawing on all available documentation, including excerpts from Grimsby's and Waters' journals. It generated some academic interest and a modest amount of controversy, with some scholars questioning whether the evidence was sufficient to prove Freeman's guilt. But to most readers, the truth was self-evident. Benjamin Freeman had been born into slavery, had endured 34 years as property, had educated himself against all odds, and had finally struck back at his oppressor using intelligence, patience, and the very crop that made Virginia wealthy. He'd turned tobacco, the foundation of the plantation economy, into a weapon of resistance and revenge. He'd killed not just one man, but several, not through passion or violence, but through calculated poisoning that mimicked natural causes. He'd escaped to freedom and built a successful, respectable life, never once betraying through word or deed what he'd done or what he was capable of doing. He'd proven, in the most dramatic way possible, that enslaved people were human beings capable of sophisticated thought and action, that they could plan and execute complex schemes, that they possessed intelligence and agency their oppressors consistently denied them, and he'd done it all with cigars. The tobacco that represented Virginia's wealth, that funded the plantation system, that was produced through enslaved labor, became the instrument of that system's destruction, at least in one small corner of Buckingham County. The masters smoked their own downfall, literally inhaling the concentrated essence of their crime. Benjamin Freeman lived free for 34 years, exactly the same number of years he'd spent enslaved. He died in his bed, surrounded by family, his secrets intact. He was buried in a Boston cemetery under a simple headstone that read, Benjamin Freeman, 1826-1894, beloved husband and father, now at rest. The Haverford plantation is farmland now, divided among several owners, its dark history known only to academics and local historians. The buildings are gone. The tobacco barns have collapsed. The quarters where 90 people once lived in bondage have returned to forest, but the land remembers. The soil that was enriched with blood and sweat and tears remembers. And somewhere in the archives, in journals and letters and research papers, the truth remains, waiting to be discovered again by each new generation that asks what really happened on that election night in November 1860, when a slave killed his master with poisoned cigars and walked away into freedom. Final CTA, Integrada Naturalmente Narrativa. This is the story of Benjamin Freeman, tobacconist, deacon, father, and murderer. It's a story about revenge and resistance, about intelligence and patience, about a man who refused to accept his status as property and did something about it. Whether you see him as villain or hero depends on where you stand, but his actions remain undeniable. He turned the symbol of his oppression into the instrument of his liberation, proving that even the most powerless could strike back if they were clever enough, patient enough, and willing to accept the consequences. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Benjamin Freeman was justified in what he did? Or do multiple wrongs never make a right, even in the context of slavery? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story as compelling as I did while researching it, hit that like button, share it with friends who appreciate dark historical mysteries, and subscribe to make sure you never miss another untold story from America's troubled past. There are more secrets buried in the archives, more forgotten truths waiting to be uncovered. Join me next time as we dig deeper into the shadows of history. Until then, remember, the past is never really dead. It's not even past.